Good afternoon, and welcome to today's launch of the revised G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. Thanks to all participants able to join us here at the OECD and to everyone following online. We are pleased to welcome for opening remarks Matthias Cormann, OECD Secretary General, and Masato Kanda, Vice Minister of Finance of Japan and Chair of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee. Carmine Di Noia, OECD Director for Financial Enterprise Affairs, will then present the revised principles and the 2023 edition of the OECD Corporate Governance Factbook, which tracks how countries implement the principles. A panel moderated by Katie Martin, Markets Editor for the Financial Times, will follow. Thank you. I am now pleased to hand over to the Secretary General.
Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to all, to my good friend and valued colleague, Vice Minister Masato Kanda, to Carmine Di Noia, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends all. A very warm welcome to this launch of the revised G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. Following on from the endorsement of the revised principles by G20 leaders at the Delhi Summit over this past weekend. The revised principles are the outcome of 18 months of intensive, very hard work. A very warm welcome to you, Vice Minister Kanda, and to the many of you for your support and your continued engagement in helping us bring this work to a successful conclusion. The revisions to the principles reflect a strong desire from all OECD and G20 member countries to see them offer guidance, and indeed guidance on company sustainability and resilience. The revisions that have been made and endorsed by G20 leaders ensure that the G20 OECD corporate governance principles remain the global standard for corporate governance, that they remain relevant to advanced and emerging economies alike by reflecting different capital market trends in different regions. So what are some of the revisions? First, they address several recent trends in capital markets. Institutional investors are playing an increasingly important role all over the world, particularly in the United States, the UK, and other advanced markets. They are the largest investors in stock markets globally, owning about 44% of total market capitalization. In parallel, the ownership of public companies is becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of company groups and the state, particularly in Asian emerging markets. For instance, 36% of listed companies globally have a private corporation as their largest shareholder, an indication of a company group structure. At the same time, state-owned companies listed on stock markets now represent more than 11% of global market capitalization. Finally, there's an increasing concern that capital markets today are better suited for larger companies. Each of these three trends has real implications for corporate governance. And each of these three trends has been reflected in the revised principles. The principles recommend that governments promote the active engagement of these investors in the governance of their portfolio companies, for example, through stewardship codes that clearly define how an institutional investor will influence their portfolio companies. With respect to company groups, the principles call for transparency of company group structures and set out how related party transactions should be managed. This will help investors generally better understand who controls companies and help ensure their interests are protected when these companies engage in transactions with one another. The principles apply equally to state-owned companies listed on stock markets, helping to ensure a level playing field. The principles can also help to facilitate access by SMEs to capital markets. For example, they now emphasize the importance of flexibility and proportionality measures which lighten regulatory burdens where appropriate to support access to public financing for smaller companies. Second, the revised principles reflect the role of corporate governance policies in addressing climate-related opportunities and risks. Already, companies representing 84% of global market capitalization disclose some sustainability-related information. The principle's new chapter on sustainability and resilience provides a comprehensive set of recommendations on sustainability disclosure, recognizing that the effects of climate change can represent a material risk when it comes to future performance. This includes emphasizing the need to disclose sustainability metrics according to internationally recognized standards and subject to external assurance. In line with expectations of both governments and investors, the principles clarify the role, rights, and interests of shareholders, boards, and stakeholders as companies undertake the important and increasingly urgent transition to net zero by 2050. Notably, they emphasize the responsibilities of boards in ensuring that companies' lobbying activities are coherent with their sustainability goals. The principles also reflect the important role that environmental, social, and governance rating and index providers and proxy advisors apply in investment and governance decisions, recommending that the methodologies they use should be transparent and publicly available. But this is particularly important when they are also used as metrics for regulatory purposes. Third, the revised principles reflect the impact of the digital transformation on corporate governance. They set out how digital technologies can enhance board supervision and facilitate corporate governance while also supporting regulatory compliance. And the revisions set out expectations for boards to effectively take account of digital risks, for example, ensuring data security and providing oversight to prevent biases from being incorporated into algorithmic models supporting decision-making. Fourth, the principles better reflect community expectations about diversity in board and executive positions. They recognize the value of diversity, including gender, in board discussions to enrich discussions and avoid groupthink. Further progress when it comes to gender diversity is very much needed. Women currently only hold about 25% of board positions across OECD and G20 countries. Governments can encourage further progress on diversity, including by requiring disclosure on gender composition of boards and senior management, and by supporting initiatives such as mentoring networks. The revisions of these principles, I should say, across all of these issues is just the first step. The sixth edition of the Corporate Governance Factbook that we're also launching today is a valuable tool for tracking and understanding how the principles are implemented around the world. It highlights that there are a variety of paths to achieve the outcomes-based objectives of the principles, reflecting each jurisdiction's legal framework and market conditions. The next edition of the Factbook, to be released in 2 years from now, will provide a timely progress report on countries' efforts to implement these revised principles we are launching today. In closing, these revised G20 OECD corporate governance principles are the result of an intensive collaborative process to ensure this important instrument remains as relevant and as impactful as ever moving forward. For the proper functioning of markets, for the protection of investors' interests, for companies' access to capital, and ultimately for driving high-quality economic growth. So a very warm thank you again to all of you who have contributed to securing the endorsement of this revised G20 OECD corporate governance principles at the G20 Leaders Summit over the weekend. And thank you for the opportunity to offer some observations as part of this launch here today. And thank you so much all for attending. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. I would now like to invite Masato Kanda, Vice Minister of Finance of Japan and Chair of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee, to give his remarks.
Thank you very much, dear Secretary General Koman, Director De Noia, and distinguished guests and OECD colleagues. It is a pleasure to join you to launch the revised G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance. As the chair of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee, it has been my great honor to guide the committee in the revision of the principles. I'm particularly pleased that the revised principles continue to represent a broad OECD G20 consensus at the highest levels, as endorsement by G20 leaders yesterday testifies. Indeed, I've just come from Delhi in India together with my respected friend Matthias, where we witnessed the G20 leaders endorsed our revised principles. This is a really great achievement, I believe. And this consensus is critical as it will ensure that the principles remain the single global standard for corporate governance. As Matthias said, this is the single global standard in this area. And it also means that the principles continue to reflect the experiences and the considerations of both advanced and emerging economies. The principles will therefore continue to guide the development of corporate governance policies, not only in economies such as the US, Japan, Germany, for instance, but also in China, India, Brazil, and other major emerging economies, covering all market economies. By providing widely accepted set of norms, the principles also contribute to fostering an open and market-based global economy. A well-functioning world economy should be guided by common principles and shared values. An international standard like the G20 OECD Corporate Governance Principles is an important tool through which their shared values and common principles are promoted around the world. By promoting open and transparent markets, the principles can also help countries and companies reap the full benefits of global capital markets. Capital markets play an important role in providing long-term patient capital and financing large-scale transitions. They not only help to strengthen the balance sheet of successful incumbent companies, but also new businesses and business models. That's why capital markets have a critical role to play in addressing major challenges such as digital and climate transitions. To reap the benefits of capital market global and long-term characteristics, policymakers should ensure that corporate governance frameworks are flexible and proportional enough to meet the needs of companies of different sizes, complexities, as well as operating under different circumstances in different jurisdictions. This will also help to increase efficiency and prevent over-regulation. While the principles provide for some flexibility in how they are implemented in each country, they also provide a common set of recommendations that can help to improve regulatory coherence globally. The fragmentation of capital market regulation creates inefficiencies and increases the cost of companies seeking to raise capital and investors willing to deploy it. This is one of the many wider economic objectives that principles can contribute to. A key lesson we have learned from nearly 25 years of promoting implementation of the principles since they were first issued in 1999 is that well-designed corporate governance policies play an important role, not only in supporting the development of capital market, but also in achieving wider economic objectives. This is true for all countries. Make revisions of the principles both essential and timely to ensure that they continue to contribute fully to these objectives. I would like to highlight three. First, as highlighted by Secretary General Coleman, well-designed corporate governance policies can support the sustainability and resilience of corporations. Attaining net zero climate objectives will require a profound transformation of our economies, and governments can't drive this transformation alone. Indeed, investors are increasingly focusing on material, climate, and other sustainability risks and opportunities. A second important role of well-designed corporate governance policies is to support market confidence and stability through sound risk management frameworks and protection of investors, including retail investors and households savings, whose savings are invested in pension and investment funds. The third important role of sound corporate governance is that it facilitates companies' access to finance from markets at reasonable costs, which supports investment in our economies. By doing so, capital markets promote innovation, productivity, and entrepreneurship, and they foster economic dynamism more broadly, as many of our economies are currently experiencing a structural decline in the number of listed companies. Facilitating companies' access to capital market financing is of critical importance. Ladies and gentlemen, the revision of the principles is an important achievement, but our work continues. We, policymakers, regulators, international organizations, and market participants all have the important role to play in putting the principles to good use so that countries and corporations continue harvesting the many benefits of good corporate governance. That's why we are also pleased to launch the 2023 edition of the OECD Corporate Governance Factbook today by providing policymakers with comprehensive information on how OECD and G20 countries implement the principles. The Factbook will help us to monitor and further promote implementation of the principles in the years to come to promote sound corporate governance, whether through the principles, the Factbook, or our other ongoing work. You can count on the OECD Corporate Governance Committee to continue leading international efforts to strengthen corporate governance. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Vice Minister. I now invite Carmina Di Noia, OECD Director for Financial and Enterprise Affairs, to present the principles.
There should be a presentation. So thank you, Matthias. Thanks, Masato, for your opening remarks. It's a real pleasure for me to join you today in launching the revised G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance and the 2023 edition of the OECD Corporate Governance Factbook. My presentation will focus mostly on the key objectives and major revisions of the principles. But before that, I would like to say a few general words about the principles themselves and the new edition of the Corporate Governance Factbook that we are also releasing today. So, new edition of the principles and the thick Factbook. Now, as already mentioned by Masato, the G20 OECD Principles of Corporate Governance are the global standard in the area of corporate governance. The principles were first developed nearly 25 years ago and endorsed by the G20 in 2015, which significantly increased their global influence. They are also one of the Financial Stability Board's key standards for sound financial systems. Now, the role of the principles is to help policymakers to evaluate, improve the legal, regulatory, and institutional framework for corporate governance. Today, 53 jurisdictions have formally adhered to the principles, including all of OECD, obviously, G20 and FSB members. Now, the principles, as you can see, are based on 6 main pillars that are essential components of good corporate governance. The basis for an effective corporate governance framework, the rights and equitable treatment of shareholders and key ownership functions, institutional investors, stock markets, and other intermediaries, disclosure and transparency, the responsibilities of the board, and sustainability and resilience, which is the new pillar that also fully incorporates the previous principles' treatment of stakeholders. Along with the revised principles, we are also launching the 2023 Corporate Governance Factbook today. It's no coincidence that we are launching the two together. The Factbook complements the principles by offering information on how they are implemented around the world. Also, the Factbook has extensive coverage of the corporate governance frameworks in 49 jurisdictions, including on corporate governance codes and regulatory institutions, shareholder rights and responsibilities, and board practices. They are presented through 61 figures and 45 interesting comparative tables. We publish the Factbook every 2 years The 2021 edition was a key reference for the revision of the principles, and this new edition contains expanded analysis of the capital market landscape and covers new issues that have been introduced in the revised principles, so including detailed comparisons of how countries are addressing corporate sustainability, virtual shareholder meetings, and company groups. Now, the principles have three strategic objectives: to promote access to finance, innovation, and entrepreneurship, to provide a framework to protect investors, and to support corporate sector sustainability and resilience. So now we'll elaborate one by one and introduce some of the main recommendations to address each of the objectives. First, good corporate governance promotes access to finance, particularly from capital markets, by contributing to the conditions in which both companies and investors, so supply and demand, find it attractive to do business. Good corporate governance helps to make access to finance cheaper and also promotes innovation, productivity, and entrepreneurship. This in turn fosters economic dynamism more broadly. Having a global standard of corporate governance to support this objective is important because capital flows of today are global in nature. In 2022, there were almost 44,000 listed companies in the world with a total market cap of around $100 trillion. At the same time, we have seen a decline in most advanced markets in the number of listed companies. The exception is in Asia, which now hosts half of all listed companies in the world and half of the most dynamic markets for IPOs, for initial public offerings. In many of these markets, company groups play a very important role, often operating in multiple jurisdictions. Meanwhile, institutional investors have become the largest owners of listed companies globally, investing a large share of their portfolios in foreign markets. With such dynamic shifts in global markets, it's more important than ever to have an up-to-date global standard that takes account of these trends and provides us with a coherent, consistent, and comparable framework in which corporations and investors can operate internationally. And with the objective of widening access to finance in mind, the principles of recommendation also seek to apply flexibility and proportionality for smaller listed companies and different circumstances. The principles include many new recommendations to address these trends and objectives. They seek to promote a clear regulatory framework for company groups by recommending that jurisdictions develop a definition and criteria for the oversight of such structures. Taking into account of the growing importance of institutional investors, the principles encourage the use of stewardship codes as a complementary tool to regulation to promote shareholder engagement and strengthen disclosure by institutional investors of their engagement and voting policies. The principles also include a new recommendation to address the increasing importance of bondholders in markets, their rights, and their importance for corporate governance. They also call for the disclosure of material information on debt contracts, including the risk of non-compliance with covenants, which we have seen recently. The revised principle also reflects the increasing use of proxy advisors, index providers, and ESG data and ratings, and aim to minimize conflict of interest that might compromise the integrity of their analysis and advice. The principles also highlight the importance of transparency of methodologies used by rating and index providers. Second, good corporate governance policies provide a framework to protect investors, which include ordinary households and pensioners' investor savings. A well-functioning framework to protect shareholder rights and ensure the equitable treatment of all shareholders is essential for households with investor savings to be able to benefit from the growth of listed companies, either directly as retail investors or indirectly through pensions and investment funds. Recommendations aimed at ensuring protection of shareholder rights, including minority and foreign shareholders, are provided across all pillars of the principles. Some key recommendations worth recalling include defining a set of basic rights to access information, participate, and vote on key matters, and sharing the profits of the corporation. extensive recommendation on oversight and disclosure of related party transactions to ensure fair treatment of all shareholders, ensuring effective enforcement against insider trading and the other violations of shareholder rights, including the opportunity to obtain effective redress at a reasonable cost without excessive delay. And finally, detailed disclosure recommendations to provide investors with quality information to support their assessment of a company value, investment, or voting decisions, notably for the timely disclosure of material information. Now, the revised principle also includes several relevant new recommendations to reinforce investor protection. They have added a new basic shareholder right to elect, appoint, or approve the external auditor. They seek to ensure that remote shareholder participation in virtual and hybrid shareholder meetings are conducted in a way that ensures equal access to information and engagement opportunities. Concerning company groups, they aim to ensure that the rights of minority shareholders are protected by recommending disclosure of capital structures, group structures, and their control arrangements in company groups, and by increasing transparency related to complex ownership structure to support effective oversight of related party transactions. And the new recommendation on bondholder rights that I mentioned previously also contains important elements such as promoting the use of enforceable and clearly defined covenants. The third objective of good corporate governance is to support corporate sector sustainability and resilience. Well-designed corporate governance policies support the sustainability and resilience of corporation, and in turn contribute to the sustainability and resilience of the broader. A sound framework for corporate governance with respect to sustainability matters can help companies recognize and respond to the interests of shareholders and all different stakeholders, as well as contribute to their own long-term success. This led to the biggest overall change in the revision of the principles, which is a new chapter on sustainability and resilience. The new recommendation on sustainability focus on three major issues. First, the disclosure of sustainability-related information. Second, the responsibilities of the board on sustainability matters. And third, the dialogue between a company and its shareholders and stakeholders on sustainability. Concerning the disclosure of sustainability-related information, the new recommendation provide guidance on the concept of materiality. They support adherence to internationally recognized standards that facilitate the comparability of sustainability-related disclosure across companies and markets. They aim to ensure that verifiable metrics are disclosed if a company publicly sets a sustainability-related goal or target. And finally, they recommend the phasing of external assurance to provide an objective assessment of a company's sustainability-related disclosure. Concerning the responsibilities of the board on sustainability, the revised principles recommend that when fulfilling their key functions, boards should ensure that they also consider material sustainability matters. And finally, the revised principles promote dialogue between a company, its shareholders, and stakeholders on sustainability matters. And this dialogue plays an essential role in informing management decision-making and in building investors' trust in long-term business strategy. Importantly, a key cross-cutting outcome of the revisions on these three objectives is to ensure accountability of board members and executives. Principle 5 of the CG principles states that the corporate governance framework should ensure, I'm quoting, the strategic guidance of the company, the effective monitoring of management by the board, and the board's accountability to the company and shareholders. The new recommendations address a broad range of issues, reflecting the increasing scope and complexity of the issues that boards are expected to manage. First, the principles recommend that the boards consider stakeholder interest when making business decisions in the interest of a company's long-term success and performance, and in the interest of its shareholders. Second, the new recommendations reflect the growing use of board committees while emphasizing flexibility in their establishment. Third, they emphasize the responsibilities of boards in risk management. These include responsibilities for ensuring risk management for company groups and addressing digital security risks. Fourth, they reflect increasing diversity considerations in board composition and senior management, and they recognize the value of gender diversity. Fifth, they recommend the use of safe harbors for management and board members' actions, such as the business judgment rule. And finally, they provide new provisions on remuneration, notably on the disclosure of remuneration levels and the use of sustainability indicators. To conclude, I believe it is fair to say the revised principles are an ambitious reference with forward-looking revisions in many areas, including on sustainability. Importantly, the principles also represent breakthrough consensus on corporate sustainability among both major, advanced, and emerging economies. This special status also gives us a special responsibility to ensure that the revised principles are implemented in order to promote access to finance, which is vital for economic resilience. Count on the OECD and its Corporate Governance Committee to promote their implementation through future work, including the Factbook. That concludes my presentation. And now we will move to the panel discussion. And I would like to thank Katie Martin for agreeing to moderate today's panel discussion, as well as our four excellent panelists whom she will introduce. So I look forward to a rich exchange on the issues raised by the revised principles and on how they can help us achieve better corporate governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmine. I would now like to invite our panelists to come up on stage for the second part of the program.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming along today. My name is Katie Martin. I'm the markets editor at the Financial Times in London. It's my absolute pleasure to be here in Paris today for the launch of these new principles of corporate governance. Thank you in particular to Carmine Di Noia, who I'm sure lots of you in this room know, for helping to extend the very warm invitation to attend here today. Also welcome to those of you who are viewing online. These principles really go to the heart of something that's very dear to the Financial Times, which is access to capital markets. It's a subject that's perhaps often overlooked or considered too abstract or taken for granted. Most ordinary people quite reasonably believe that financial markets exist in a separate universe that they cannot really understand or affect. In fact, as Vice Minister Masato Kanda has pointed out, it was capital markets with considerable assistance from central banks and governments that kept businesses alive when COVID struck. The past few years have shown that also the ability for the public to affect capital markets is very real. Public understanding of the mechanics of financial markets remains weak, but I'm struck by just how much issues around governance and sustainability have hit the mainstream of every part of markets, from private markets to public equities and loans and bonds. Sometimes this means that the issue gets unnecessarily political, but broadly, it's clear that investor protection, corporate resilience, and stewardship are important parts of the capital allocation process now. And much of that came from grassroots calls for change, for markets to be accountable and to rest on solid foundations. Financial stability is something that people really cherish. And as markets compete to remain relevant, as we've just been hearing about the decline of public ownership of equities or of public companies these days, it's very important to avoid a race to the bottom in standards between different jurisdictions. So the FT has written extensively about how companies interact with markets, about who is successful in tapping pools of capital and on what terms, and how jurisdictions can create healthy market ecosystems that help to foster growth. No single set of regulations or principles or listing requirements or anything else can make that happen in isolation, but the interaction of all of those elements matters greatly. I'm joined today by an extremely distinguished panel of people to help discuss these important issues. Directly to my left, Ms. Patricia Barbizet is chair of the Association of Large French Companies, the AFEP. She currently holds board member positions in large companies and was chair of the supervisory board and then vice chair of Caring. Mrs. Barbizet is president and founder of Temaris et Associés, a technology and innovation investment company. Between 2018 and 2023, she was president of the High Corporate Governance Committee, responsible for ensuring the proper implementation of the AFEP-MEDEF code. Mrs. Gun Nielsen is the chair of the Swedish Corporate Governance Board. She was CEO of Melker Schörling AB between 2017 and 2022. And she previously worked for many years, primarily as chief financial officer for different companies. Ms. Nielsen serves as board member of Hexagon and is a member of the boards of a number of other companies, including Bonnier and Konecranes. She previously served on the boards of Dometic and Husqvarna, among others. Mr. Pier Carlo Padoan is no stranger to these corridors of the OECD. He's the chairman of the board of UniCredit. He's also a member of the board of directors of the Italian Banking Association and a member of the Corporate Governance Committee of the Italian Stock Exchange. Mr. Padoan was previously Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy and a member of the Chamber of Deputies. He was also Deputy Secretary General and Chief Economist of the OECD and Executive Director of the IMF. And last but not least, Mr. Amarjit Singh is a whole-time member, which is equivalent to the rank of Commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Board of India. With nearly 3 decades of service in SEBI, he has wide experience in regulation and supervision of securities markets. In his previous role as Executive Director at SEBI, he headed the Market Regulation Department, Corporate Finance Department, and the Office of International Affairs. Mr. Singh has been involved in various international regulatory initiatives, including as chair of the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO's Assessment Committee. He's represented SEBI on various national level committees, including those set up by the Reserve Bank of India and the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Thank you all so much for traveling sometimes long distances to appear here today. So broadly, we're going to split this conversation into 2 sections, first on sustainability and then on capital markets. Taking sustainability first, Patricia Barbizet, investors are increasingly focusing on the sustainability of companies and calling for better disclosure of sustainability-related information. I know it's something they speak to me about often. What challenges do companies face in improving disclosure, particularly concerning the use of metrics and indices around ESG?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you for having me here. It's a very incredibly important topic. And I would like to make just a few introductory remarks just before answering more directly your question. First, to congratulate the OECD for this revision, which is very appropriate to tackle the problem that we have emerged since 2015, the need for companies to adapt to strategy to climate, the pandemic, the supply chain disruptions, the emergence of various new risks, including cyber risk, climate-related risks, the importance of reporting, and specifically sustainability reporting. All that make a whole new period, and I think the appropriate Factbook 2023 is really, really key. So thank you for having done that. As a former chairperson of the High Committee of Corporate Governance and board member of several listed companies for many years, I specifically support the importance given to soft law and to corporate governance codes under the comply or explain principle, which provides a flexible approach while taking into account the specificities that the companies and the local practices. I can give an example for the AFEP-MEDEF code, which has been deeply revised to integrate, according to the different years, various ESG recommendation, presentation on the climate strategy, to the AGM at least every 3 years, issues relating to social and environmental responsibility, the specialized committee of the board for responsibility, which prepares the works of the board. So there is 2 steps of really making sure that the company really address those things, and CSR criteria in executive base. That demonstrates the soft law's capacity to adapt quickly to market requirements, even in between 2 adjustments from the OECD's principles. It's emphasized given to gender diversity. I also support the emphasis given to gender diversity, not only for board members, but as well for senior management. Indeed, a company which effectively deploys a gender diversity policy will better attract and retain female talents, and other talents generation as well is very key, addressing those topics. And to motivate teams at the most senior level, spread out a culture of diversity in the entire group is a key aspect for many, many companies. And we report that in the special committees to the board and the boards to the AGM. So it's now really one of the key parts. French companies have taken action to promote culture of diversity and inclusion within their teams at a larger scale: age, nationalities, qualifications, professional experience. So it's not only about gender, it's much broader than that. Indeed, these issues does not have only a moral dimension, but it also have implications for competitiveness. A company can only grow and develop it if it reflects society as a whole. And however, companies are frequently requested by some investors to appoint a racially or ethnically diverse board member. I have to recall that the process of personal data that directly or indirectly reveal the racial or ethnic origin of individuals is prohibited by the French law. And I think it's an important prohibition. The OECD principle provides a new chapter dedicated to sustainability. Many of the principles are already embedded in the French legal framework, especially in terms of implications for board members and reporting obligations. So once again, congratulations to this comprehensive work, which tackles the right issue at the right moment and of the right scale. Now we'll come back to more declarative question. In the EU, an impressive set of regulation has been set up over the last few years to ensure social and environmental reporting for large companies. Over the past 10 years, the European Union has developed new non-financial reporting standards. The sweet-sounding legal acronyms of NFRDs or CSRDs refer to the Non-Financial Reporting Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. These, behind the acronym, the European directives seek in particular to enhance the reliability, accessibility, and relevance of ESG information in order to facilitate the stakeholders' judgment in terms of sustainability. And that's key. In this information is primarily focused on investors. It's as well intended to inform all stakeholders of the company in a broader sense, internally and outside. The European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS, which take the form of a 240 pages delegated act published last July, cover a very large range of topics and raise several challenges for the companies. First, the new requirements will come in force as to January 1st, 2024, so it's very soon, for large listed companies, which give them very little time to be ready, especially considering the complexity and the volume of the new standards. Second, ESRS tackled a large range of issues. Environmental issues first, climate change, pollution, marine resources, water, biodiversity. Social affairs, second, workers' conditions, workers in the value chain. Governance, the composition of the administrative, management, and supervisory bodies, their role, their responsibility, their access to expertise and skills with regard to sustainability matters. And business conduct, prevention and detection of corruption, political influence, and lobbying activities. All that represents more or less 1,000 data points that have to be disclosed if material for the company, which is a huge amount of points. Third, the directive applies the double materiality principle, which requires company to include in the management report both how sustainability issues affect the company's performance, the outside-in perspective, and how the company itself impacts people and environments, the inside-out perspective. This materiality assessment, which is the starting point for sustainability reporting, must be conducted in accordance with the EU sustainability standards, including through interactions with stakeholders. Companies remain free to organize their materiality assessment as they deem appropriate. This is good news, and it was a key demand from AFEP companies. But this exercise of identifying and assessing impacts, risks, and opportunities, and their financial effects is a huge challenge, because it concerns not only a company's own activities, but also those of its direct and indirect business relationship in the upstream and downstream value chain. In practice, for a multinational company, it takes more or less 18 months to conduct such an assessment. ESRS leave off a few months. Guidelines from EFRAG will be much appreciated. Fourth, collecting data on a company's upstream and downstream value chain is one of the most difficult tasks because some business relations do not cooperate. Usually, the further down the supply chain and the further away on the globe, it's more difficult. The more obstacles the company have to face. Aware of this constraint, the EU legislation allows companies for the first 3 years to explain why not all the necessary information regarding its value chain are available. Fifth, some sustainable reporting requirements are entirely new in nature because they include forward-looking information which raise questions about possible new risk of civil liability, both for companies and for their managers. The risk is all the greater as companies will have to publish objectives, particularly in terms of climate transition. If it appears these objectives cannot be achieved, listed companies will have to communicate to the market immediately to adapt their objectives accordingly and to explain the reason for doing so. Indeed, the market's rules still remain in force. The information disclosed to the market must be accurate, precise, and truthful. That will be quite a challenge as well. We may fear that companies will be obliged to multiply ESG warnings, similar to profit warnings, in order not to be fined for disclosing false information. All that will have to adapt between the governments, the authorities, and the regulations, and the companies, of course. Above all, issuers must anticipate the risk of being criticized for their communications regarding sustainability by different actors in civil society, including NGOs, which will put pressure on managers regarding carbon emissions, social condition, diversity, and maybe some other topics. My last point will be the need for convergence as far as reporting is concerned, and the overall consistency of the European Sustainable Finance Regulatory Framework. As ESRS standards have now been adopted by the Commission, I'm totally convinced that we need a solid, unique, and workable set of international standards which reflect how companies address sustainability-related risk and opportunities. European companies cannot be the only one in the world to publish such information. European companies can tackle image alone. Therefore, maximum interoperability between EU and international standards is essential to avoid diverging requirements. EU company will have to respect mandatory EU standards on one hand, and also apply the ISSB standards requested by international investors on the other hand. Therefore, close cooperation between EFRAG and ISSB is essential to avoid multiple reporting and duplications. As regards the European Sustainable Finance Regulatory Framework, stakeholders need a more holistic and pragmatic approach. requiring investors to report on data that are not available. In other words, adopting the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR, before the Corporate Sustainability, CSRD, is probably putting the cart before the horse, and that can be counterproductive. We have all to work to use concept in different pieces of legislation and to harmonize as much as we can to avoid create confusions and increase risk of non-complier or to greenwashing. To conclude, I'm convinced that capitalism must evolve responsibly. However, I'm deeply concerned about the cost of compliance of legislation such as CSRD, the taxonomy, regulation, and all kinds of standards and different environmental sustainable contribution. Future of due diligence directive will be as well a difficult moment to adapt and probably a costly one, so we have to be prepared for that as well. Without questioning the interest of this legislation, we have to face the evidence that in a globalized economy, requirements may negatively impact the competitiveness of European companies vis-à-vis their international competitors, which could be not subject to the same level of constraints. In that context, the proposal of the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to put forward concrete proposals to simplify reporting requirements and reduce them by 25% is very welcome. And if the 25% reduction is not realized before the EU election next year, I certainly hope that the next Commission will pursue the same objective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for all that insight into how standards like this interact with the real world of actually running companies, which is a super important.
How we have to comply, comply and explain, but I have to comply.
Exactly. Gun Nielsen, on a similar note, actually, many companies are facing pressure from shareholders, employees, and civil society to consider environmental and social matters, in particular climate change. Those of us who were in Paris at the weekend know that that's a very real thing. Human rights and gender equality. What do you think are the best tools available to companies to build constructive dialogue on these issues between themselves, shareholders, and other stakeholders?
Thank you, Katie. That was a big one, I think. But I believe you are making a question that a lot of companies, individuals and different authorities, and not the least consultants, presently are discussing and trying to find a relevant and balanced solution concerning the dialogue for the different interest groups. But in my view, all groups should have or probably have the same goal, and that is the well-being of the company and its development. And thereby also it can contribute to the value creation of the company. And business plays a key role to handle environmental and social economic challenges and constitutes a cornerstone in building a sustainable economy and society. Creating the right preconditions then for the business to successfully contribute is therefore essential. And coming back to that. But my experience being working a long time in business is that companies already have during a long time engaged themselves in different environmental and social matters and included them as well in part of their way of doing business. But so for me, this is not new, but it may be the communication or disclosure around it which is new. And that is not being clear enough how that has been developed. And maybe also other stakeholders, shareholders, employees, customers and suppliers have not put enough focus on the issues before. So my experience is that companies need to include these matters in their day-to-day operation and also in mid and long-term planning. It is a constant development. It's not a one thing to do because it's a license to operate for the company. So, but we all know that different companies start from different levels and the speed of change is also different in different companies and different industries. So I personally believe that it has to be different as well because companies are not the same. And I personally support increased communication and disclosure around the companies and how they are developing in different areas in both environmental and social matters, as long as the information reported is relevant for the company's operation and thereby contribute also to the value creation of the business. And then if it's positive for the economy and society as well. And so I believe that you should use tools which you probably already have in your toolbox in the companies, but be even more proactive and transparent. I think that is key to be transparent. Use the communication on the web, annual report, meeting with shareholders, customers, suppliers, analysts, and investors to spread the positive words about the company's development, but with the relevant fact-based KPIs. But I think most important also is that to be transparent internally in the companies. Make sure that all the employees you have knows the facts. Regular continuous education in the companies. And because every employee is an ambassador for the company's attractiveness. I think also, and hearing you, Patricia, talking about the new EU regulations, less is more. And what I mean with that is that I think the KPIs being measured and reported and disclosed has to be closely linked to the business and the development of the operation. In my view, it supports stakeholders to understand that it is important KPIs for the well-being of the company. And if it's positive or negative for development, and there also, if you have what type of effect it has for the sustainable economy and society. So I'm not a huge fan of long lists and hundreds of KPIs or even thousands, or ticking the box lists. Personally, I think that these do not give stakeholders the focus on what is important for the individual company or industry and its business, and definitely increase the risk of reporting washing. I'm a fan of the device, one size do not fit all. I would be happy if different interested stakeholders or parties would appreciate if companies selectively report on KPIs relevant for the business as their peers, and thereby give them a chance to understand and follow the development over the years. And I have also a deep concern on the implementation of the new EU CSRD directive. That concern has to do with the short implementation time, instructions and definitions which are not complete yet, even if it should be implemented already beginning of next year. And we have a world audit organization and companies who do not know how they should audit it, and even not knowing how they should report on the audit, on what they have and where to report it. And I think that is really a big risk for failure of to implement a valuable tool with good intentions, but I hope I'm wrong. I would also have a humble request on the different stakeholders. Be patient. Give the transparent communication and disclosure on environmental and social matters some time to develop. Like you did actually with the financial reporting, when that has been continuously developed. That's more than 50 years has taken to where we are today, and it continues to develop. So to conclude from me, my basic view is that these things are licensed to operate for companies. Proactive transparency, and especially internally in the companies. Less is more. One size do not fit all, and be patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Gun, for those very clear messages. Piercarlo Paduan, as chair of a large international listed company, what role do you think a board should play in ensuring that a company integrates climate considerations in its risk management and corporate strategy?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, and allow me to thank the OECD for being back here. It's a dive in my past. I've spent 7 years in this place. I've been sitting many times in this podium, and it's always like first time you get stage fright. But more seriously, before I answer specifically to your question, let me recall a couple of points which are typically OECD style, which I think it's worth reassuring today in this new product, for which I congratulate the team and my friends. The 2 points, which are typically OECD and go beyond the specific product we're discussing about. One is that the OECD has been one of the leaders, if not the leader, of seeking international cooperation results at times of huge crisis. We are now in a very deep crisis, which is much more complicated than the one we went through at the time of the global financial crisis at the end of the first decade of the century. But at that time, the beyond emergency, beyond responding to the recession, the big issue, the big ambition of the G20, look us here, was to rebuild global governance. And today we are facing more or less the same target, only with a complication that it's not just about economics and finance. It's about security. It's about war, or rather the absence of war. And all these, it's about pandemic. So it's hitting at the roots of everyday's life. And this is why the demand for cooperation coming from societies is rising. And one could interpret, if you wish, ESG rising as a device to signal problems is so speedily going up, because there is a demand. And I'm making this point because I think that contributions like the one we are discussing today fall into this category. They respond to a demand coming from society, and they put on the table a new policy agenda. If you look again at the past experience of the OECD as a contributor to reestablishing global governance, then you find that the OECD, as I was mentioning at the beginning, was the initiator, the facilitator of a major reform, which is a reform about taxation. It was not full taxation reform, but certainly was a big chunk of taxation issues. This was one of the few examples of successful international cooperation. So I am convinced that this new product of international collective action, if I may use that term, global principles, is part of a set of building blocks that will be instrumental in reestablishing global governance. So this is my first point, and I congratulate the OECD for keeping on this tradition. The second point is one which was touched upon already by the other speakers, is that the OECD is not only about public policy. This is what I thought when I joined the institution. It's more and more about society. And it's more and more about the interaction between society, public policy, and individuals. This is a way of presenting issues which I think is becoming more and more compelling. And one way, not the only one way of having a view about norms, institutions, regulatory structures at the global level is exactly to take that interaction more explicitly to the foreground. So this is my first point. To translate my first point into your possible answer to your question, boards have to take this into account from the very start of their activity. Boards, especially boards of companies that have an international, if not global, dimension, must have diversity, not just as a gender problem or opportunity, rather, I should say, but also as a must in terms of skills. Sometimes looking at the board and you count your colleagues around the table and you look at the agenda you have today on the table, say, oh my God, we're not enough because we need more skills. And indeed, since skills are produced, are innovated very rapidly these days, we need to find ways to pour the production of skills into board decisions. Second point about the board responsibility. What should be the board doing, especially given the time dedicated to board is, after all, in spite of what one thinks, not enough for work. Not that I want to work more, by the way, but because this is a fact. We need to find ways to incorporate general principles into activities. Speaking from the point of view of a financial institution, this is extremely relevant. Not that others are not relevant. This is particularly compelling because we at the bank need to translate into risk assessment and financial decisions which are based on risk assessment, new principles and new ways of looking at the global system. This is the big challenge. Of course, in doing so, there is something that helps, but sometimes doesn't help. What helps is the fact that there must be an interaction between the private sector, the companies that work by those principles, and the public sector, which produces the elements of background against which companies must operate. It is an interactive job. It's not just you go on stage and I listen to you and then we do the opposite. It's companies, private sector, institutions, both national and international, that have to interact continuously. This is why an institution like the G20 is so important, by the way. The G20 was instrumental, as I said, in producing some reforms. The tax reform of the G20 was initiated. Allow me to remind this because it was, I was on the other side of the table, so to speak. It was exactly started to develop here, and I'm happy to see this. By the way, if I may, this should not sound as a polemic. The life of the OECD G20 meeting at the beginning was not easy. And you know why? Because the non-Western, non-OECD member states, also members of the G20, thought that this was not the OECD's business to go around. Fortunately, they recognized, and now they're fully supportive, that that was a wrong position. I am concerned that because of huge problems in global surveillance and security, the G20 might lose steam. And I congratulate the G20 in being able to find a diplomatic success, which is important, in spite of a very difficult situation. But let me conclude with one point. I've taken too much time already. So to repeat the point, the board must be put in a position to assess the challenges, exploit opportunities, and translate those principles into day-by-day operation. Let me just develop this point very briefly, having in mind Europe. Europe badly needs what we might call a financial union. That is to say, the combination of a banking union and a capital markets union. Why is that the case? Well, for one very simple reason. The challenges that the global system is facing in terms of sustainability of the environment and so forth simply need the private sector to succeed. We cannot think that this is going to be a public policy affair and the private sector will say, no, thanks, I don't think I like it. That's impossible. It's going to be failure. So we need to find ways through which the private sector incorporates and translates into effective working the principles, but the public sector generates the environment, including the policy environment, that facilitates that. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So my last point is, it's important that this very useful piece of work is seen as helpful not only of the companies, but also of the institutions. And in the case of Europe, this is particularly important. I am particularly disappointed by what happens in Europe in these terms. And I'm thinking about the so-called ring fencing and fragmentation. I may provoke you by saying that we think we have a banking union. We don't have a banking union because there are obstacles to the mobility of resources and liquidity, which simply eliminate the benefits of having an integrated financial market, which is size and level playing fields, and therefore good institutions. So this is where we stand today. These are difficult challenges. However, I think that the OECD and other international institutions and global governance can produce a result which will be worth using and making life easier for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Some provocative thoughts there, and also some very useful insight into this issue. Amarjit Singh is going to bring us some great insight from a different part of the world, really. The transition to a low carbon economy will also require significant public action. What do you see for market regulators? What role do you see for market regulators in finding the right balance that we've all been speaking about already here today, between ensuring that there's a regulatory framework to support public company access to finance that will be needed to support the green transition, while at the same time establishing more specific sustainability related disclosure requirements? You know, they have to be able to survive contact with the real world. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, but I'll come to that in a minute. I must thank OECD for having me in this conversation, and also, inviting me at this very important event of the launch of the principles. So one has been sort of involved in this activity for the last almost 2 years now. And let me also say that this revision is very timely to my mind. We are witnessing a number of, if I can say, mega trends in the society, in the economies. So sustainability is one of them. And I'm glad, the new chapter on sustainability has been added. And you have, other trends also, like hyper digitization and acceleration of artificial intelligence. And all these, trends have implications for business and industry and economies. So from my limited, experience of the standard setting work, I think it's very important to keep a sharp eye on the evolution of standards, so that the standards don't become stale and they are revised from time to time. I'm not saying you should do it very often, because that creates issues. We need the new standards to settle in, stabilize, but keep a sharp eye on what's going on and how they impact the standards. So sorry for this digression. Coming to your question. First, let me talk very briefly about the significance of climate finance before I come to the question of finance versus disclosure, and is there a trade-off? So clearly, just to state the obvious, if the world has to move to low carbon economies, to clean energy, you need lots of money. You need lots of funds. The recently concluded G20 declaration also talks about it. And there is an estimate that you need $4 trillion per year globally for moving to clean energy. And the amount is higher for the developing economies. I think it is $5.8 trillion per year. So apparently you need loads of money, and you need to see where this money is going to come from. And I believe governments, multilateral institutions, financial regulators like us, we all have to see how the flow of money can be, directed to more sustainable economies and the clean energy and so on. So clearly it's an important issue, and we have to recognize that. Now coming to your question in terms of, on the one hand, you have the need for finance, and on the other hand, as a regulator, you also want to make sure that enough disclosures are there. So is there a trade-off? So to my mind, I think there is no trade-off. There is probably no trade-off. Both go hand in hand. When companies raise money as sustainable finance, or for the purpose of clean energy, etc., investors who are investing, they have an implicit faith that this money is going to be invested in the sustainable activities. And and as a regulator, we have to make sure that there is a transparency in the process, because if the money which is being raised for sustainable investments, if it is diverted elsewhere, then that creates a trust issue, and that will not be good for the markets. And that also creates the greenwashing related issues. Also, whether the investments, whether the products are true to the label or not, in case, let's say, if you have a fund which claims to be investing in sustainable activities, but it is not investing exactly in those activities and diverts, then you're not being true to the label that you, told the market about. So to my mind, I think the both go hand in hand, and as a regulator, while we need to encourage, for example, just to give you example from India, we have a green bond framework. We've just come out with blue bonds, yellow bonds, and so on. But so we have actually stipulated additional disclosures if you want to raise money through green bonds. So if I can talk a little bit about, let me just move to how the sustainability disclosure space is evolving. And I think there are very, very rapid sort of evolution which is happening as I speak. In Europe already, I think we've talked about ESRS and CSRD and so on. In US, again, they have announced the draft rules in 2022. If I can talk about India, we came out with a framework called BRSR, Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting. So by the way, our journey on the sustainability reporting started way back in 2012 in a small way, but we started with the requirement for disclosure by top 100 companies in 2012. Let me not bother you with the details, but in 2021, we did a comprehensive revision of the sustainability disclosure framework. It is called BRSR. We very consciously followed a climate plus approach. The disclosures are not only on the climate, but also on the social and governance factors. And it is mandatory for the top 1,000 listed companies. First year, we kept it voluntary. In our part of the world, our experience has been that the voluntary doesn't really work. So we have to have a mandatory requirement. And but to tell you, in fact, even in the year when it was voluntary, about 180 odd companies chose to disclose on their own. Although it has about more than 400 plus data points. It is outcome oriented. Let me just make one more point before I conclude. So there are two dominant forces in the area of disclosures. One is the investors, and I think investors have, and probably they came in the game before regulators stepped in, and the investors have been pushing for climate-related disclosures, and not only just from the companies which are raising green finance, but even from the companies which are not specifically raising green finance. Investors have been asking for these disclosures. And regulators and governments and ministries have stepped in later. And they are, of course, now the way I see it, these requirements are gradually becoming more mandatory than voluntary or comply or explain. So there's a huge transition happening, but I completely agree with your point that we need to give enough time, because even the financial reporting took a long time to evolve, and we need to give enough time to the stakeholders to adapt to the new disclosure requirements. So finally, again, one size does not fit all, and I completely agree with that, because different parts of the world have different priorities, and they're at different stages of development. So probably we should give enough space and flexibility for the disclosure frameworks and the timelines to evolve. But I think on the whole, we are on the right track, and there is no trade-off.
Thank you so much. And as we have you here, can I just quickly ask a follow-up question around what to your mind is the latest trends and developments in corporate governance in India? It has been a matter of huge global attention recently.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So one is, of course, we we've always been and we're concerned about the abusive related party transactions. So that is one area which we keep a close eye on. Then, we are also, in fact, just to give you a bit of a context, in India, the institutional ownership has increased over time. And I think now it is close to 35%. And so we have a stewardship code for institutions, especially the mutual funds and the alternative investment funds. So since these institutional investors are the trustees of public money, so we feel that, they have to exercise, they have to play a critical role when it comes to their participation in the general body meetings of the companies as a shareholder. And again, we have, as I said, we like the mandatory way. So we have mandated mutual funds also to, and this has evolved over time. So we've mandated mutual funds to compulsorily vote. They have no right to abstain. Now, earlier they had the right to abstain. They could yes, no, abstain. They could choose to abstain on various, the various votes that come up in the AGMs. But now they have to, vote and explain the rationale of their voting. So that is another area. We feel that, this is an important piece where institutional investors can play a very important role in improving the corporate governance of the companies. Then we are also, although it's not strictly our domain, I mean, we deal with listed companies, but the startup sector, which has evolved very rapidly world over, including India, a lot of startup companies which want to list. And so we are concerned about what happens before you list, what happens in those companies where you, so we are bringing in certain, I would say, new kind of requirements at the time of listing. We are looking at shareholder agreements. If there are special shareholder agreements which give special rights to certain set of shareholders, which affect the control or which affect the important decisions, which can in turn impact the minority investors. So we have stipulated the disclosure of those shareholder agreements. And also we are saying, once you've got an agreement, it doesn't mean that it is set for life. You have to go back to your shareholders once in 5 years and take the approval once again, because the shareholders keep changing. And if there are any rights which are not in the interest of minority shareholders, they should have a right to oppose. So these are some of the things that we are dealing with.
Thanks so much. We're going to move on in the conversation now to capital markets, a particularly hot issue in Europe, but also around the world. As the OECD report has been pointing out, there's been some huge shifts over the past few years. Pierre Caro-Paduan, capital markets in most European economies are underperforming in relation to Asia and other markets. And progress on creating a European capital markets union is slow, as you were talking about earlier. What role can better corporate governance play in boosting capital markets in Europe? Is this an important part of the puzzle to your mind?
Thanks for the question. And unfortunately, it's great to be European, but sometimes very painful. The competitiveness of a financial market rests on few key elements, one of which is scale. If I were to mention one reason why the US financial market performs better than the European one, I would certainly start scale. It's not the only one, but if you don't have one like that, then the rest doesn't come. The second, and we know that so far, banking union has been stopped by the fact that scale was not considered to be in the interest of some governments, some countries. I will not say some are better than others, but it's a chapter of the story which I used to have to read when I look at the European integration in the past couple of decades. It's the fact that risks are seen many times as the responsibility of individual countries, and there is no room for risk sharing. At the same time, when you ask for more risk sharing, some countries would say, if you want to have more risk sharing, you don't have to look for it in fiscal policy or in the budget policy. You have to look at it in the private sector, capital markets. So we are in a loop because we want more risk sharing, but we don't want to give it in terms of public sector risk sharing. We want to have it in terms of private sector risk sharing. The problem is that you don't have private sector risk sharing if you don't move towards capital markets union. And that is stopped by all the little day-by-day impediments to reallocation of finance and reallocation of liquidity, which are the basic bread and butter elements of a capital markets union to work. So there is a problem which has to do with quote unquote collective action. You may say you may say it's not about finance, but that's not true. What to do? Well, one thing is to be patient and to understand that the process of integration in Europe has taken a long time. It's gone through a number of crises. So you have to be patient and prepared to suffer at the same time, because you have to go through crisis. But that there are ways to make progress. And let me just mention a couple which are in the debate today. One is about so-called branchification. The idea is that a group like the one I am working for right now, who is present in 13 member states of the European Union, should not have, as it is the case today, subsidiaries of the main branches in each one of those. Rather should have branchification, which by definition makes it easier to steer resources around the area. So that is one element which moves towards more integration, which we need at a low level, with an understatement, so to speak. The other element, which is not coming up, but which I think will be coming up all of a sudden, is innovation. We are facing a world where we are seeing a number of strategic innovation coming up on center stage all at once. Digitalization, digital currency, artificial intelligence, so forth. These things are going to interact. They're not going to be waiting for permission being given by authorities. And guess what? They are already interacting much better in the United States than here. So another positive force which could bring more integration and more effectiveness is not on the center stage because of that. That does not exhaust the list of problems, but let me stress the point that there is here, again, scope for interaction. I mentioned in my previous remarks that the OECD has been great in providing international public goods, international economic regimes like tax policy, and the G20 has endorsed politically this issue. Well, this means that there are formulae which see the interaction of international institutions, private sector and national governments to produce what we want. But then we have to agree, and that is the big collective action jump that can come. Again, I remain optimistic this will happen, but this is the way I see it. And I said, I am afraid that we are in a loop if we don't go beyond it.
Thank you for that. And Gun, as we were just hearing, the number one thing that the US has got that Europe often doesn't have is scale in financial markets. But at the same time, Sweden stands out in Europe with its vibrant equity market. What lessons are there for the rest of Europe and potentially even globally in capital markets development?
Yeah, I believe you're making a very interesting and relevant observation. During last decade, Sweden has seen steady increase in the number of listed companies. And you're correct that it runs in contrary to the experience in other markets. So between 2010 and 2021, Sweden had a net increase, that is listing minus delistings, of more than 400 listed companies. During the same time, both Germany and France had a net decrease of 400 and 200 companies respectively. And among the larger European markets, only Italy and Spain had a slight increase in net listings. So only in 2021 alone, there were a total of 185 listings in Sweden, which brought the total number of listed companies in Sweden to 1,024. And that made Sweden to the third largest equity market in the European Union by market capitalization, and the largest market by the number of listed companies. So even in this turbulent year we are in now, it looks like we will have an increase of listed companies, and a few also in the pipeline. I know that it is a priority for the European Commission to promote a more vibrant capital market in general, and better corporate access to equity in particular. I strongly support this ambition. But before I comment your question here, I want to underline that a vibrant and well-functioning European capital market is not an end in itself. It's a means to provide European business with capital for a long term and growth, and also kind of innovative risk taking that we need, not least to finance the transition of the green economy. So it goes without saying that if we want European capital markets to serve entrepreneurship, innovation and risk taking, the financial sector has to be equally flexible and innovative. So in this respect, I would brag a little bit and they claim that Sweden is perfect. But I think there are a couple of guiding principles that served Sweden very well. And the first one is freedom of contract. And the second one is transparency. And a freedom of contract is necessary because no government or regulator can foresee or appreciate the specific needs among highly sophisticated companies and investors. And consumer protection rules and strong minority protection rules will always be there to look after any retail investor. So when you ask for possible lessons from Sweden, perhaps this approach could be one. And possibly the European Commission has already found some inspiration. And I'm thinking about the recent Listing Act initiative. I believe that the European Commission is right in the proposal when they argue that allowing multiple voting shares will stimulate entrepreneurship and listings. And one reason is that it will give the entrepreneurship founders access to new risk capital to develop the business without losing control of the company and grow as independent company. So in terms of market value, about 70% of Swedish listed companies have chosen this solution. And coupled with well-developed rules for minority protection and equal treatment of shareholders, it has served the Swedish business sector very well. What bothers me, however, is that some voices have raised to constrain the use of multiple voting shares by so-called safeguards, like sunset clauses. From a Swedish perspective, that would severely limit the function of multiple voting shares, which has served the Swedish business well for more than 100 years. And more than ever in today's dynamic world, flexibility rather than rigidity should be the lead word. But perhaps more important than the Swedish experience, I believe that the revised G20 OECD principles provide excellent guidance on those issues when, in principle 2E, clearly state that the optional capital structure of company, which obviously include the voting rights structure, is the best decided by the management and the board, subject to the approval of shareholders. From my experience in business, OECD presents a pragmatic and transparent approach to ensure cost-efficient or effective financing in the interest of both the company and the investors. If Sweden can serve as additional inspiration, we are obviously more than happy to provide additional information and insights. But I would also like to highlight the Swedish corporate governance model as another tool for successful development. It is about applying the code, which is a combination of written rules and generally accepted principles. Either you comply or you explain why you don't comply. The code has an independent self-regulatory body with different stakeholders from the business community to supervise and develop and maintenance of good ethics on the capital market. The advantages of self-regulation is how we see it. It's flexible and it can be developed and adapted quickly in response to changes. Self-regulation probably has lower costs for companies compared with legislation developed remotely from the market, and it prevents overly detailed legislation. To finalize, I would also just comment that Sweden has had different type of stimulus from authorities to promote individuals to complement the long-term saving structure as well with owning shares in publicly listed companies. So for example, there's been tax efficient owner accounts and competitive trading platforms which can be used. So in Sweden, out of 10 million people, roughly 3 million individuals have invested in shares in listed companies, which is rather big, I think. So success in Sweden is a mix of all these actions. There's probably a lot of things that I haven't mentioned, but so far we are proud of what has been done so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Gun. Tricia, I'd like to come to you on this issue now. I mean, some companies argue that regulations are too cumbersome and that discourages them from going public. As we were just hearing, Sweden is perfect, I think is the word. So that's an example of how this can be done. What should be the main regulatory priorities to ensure more companies go public and use capital markets to grow, to your mind?
Well, thank you. We try to be Swedish. First, we are changing. Where do we start from? We are in a changing environment. The role of capital markets and especially equity markets is more than ever essential, to my understanding. Many companies need to recapitalize in the wake of the COVID pandemic, or they need to reduce the debt ratio. In addition, we've been discussing about sustainability, and we all know that financing the transition will require huge amounts of long-term investments. Second point is that we are moving away from a very low interest environment into a more normal or classical economic situation. Rising interest rates will obviously impact the financing of companies, and also not only of listed companies, but also of the private sector, private equity sector. And private equity is the main competitor, who has been in the last years the main competitor to public markets. Eventually, for AFEP, companies are all very large and can more easily access to capital market than small and medium companies. Most of our members are already listed on a regulated market, and many of them are frequent issuers. So it's a special category of companies. The European Action Plan for a Capital Market Union. The capital markets regulatory framework has been significantly strengthened over the last 2 decades. Pros are we have now a very good level and high level of protection for investors and a high level of transparency, in particular in terms of reporting. The cons are the requirements companies have to comply with, and which can indeed increase the cost of listing, can scare some companies from going public. So we need to strike the right balance between investor protection and financial stability, and on one hand, and facilitating access to capital markets on the other hand. I believe that European policymakers, and in particular the European Commissions, are aware and attentive to that, pay attention to that situation. So measures have been put forward to address already these issues. The Commission has launched an action plan for Capital Market Union. Many stakeholders complain that this action plan is moving slowly, but the European co-legislator, the European Parliament and the Council have adopted a measure that support the ESAP regulation establishing a European single access point. It means it's a big acronym, but it's a very important situation if we can solve those difficulties from an administrative access and facilitate access and financial information published to the companies. So that will have to as well to work on reducing the cost of being listed as well for financial companies. Commission has as well published a listing act, which includes some alleviations to facilitate access to capital markets. For example, exemption for the obligation to publish a prospectus for companies already listed, that they offer a percentage of their securities which is not over 40% of their existing securities. We support at AFEP that exemption. It's a significant alleviation, and if even the Council wanted to go lower than the 40th thresholds, and there are discussions at the European Parliament for that, on whether the exemption should be detrimental to investor protection or not. We consider that it would be a missed opportunity not to adopt that and to take that step for the best of the capital markets. And I think we have already made a great part of the deal to have a protected transparency and level of protection and transparency is already very high in Europe now. So as quickly as we can, if we can adopt that listing act, it could be a very proposed by the Commission. It would be really a good thing. And Ms. van der Leyen is as well trying to. The Commission would simplify and reduce by 25% the reporting burden of the companies. That would be a good news, and also we are awaiting for the proposals from the Commission. Other regulatory priorities could be additional point that we could mention: promoting institutional investor participation in IPOs, reconsidering regulatory cost or restriction on pension funds and insurance companies, and possibly other financial firms investing in public equity markets. That could be another way to promote the market. The second would be building on corporate governance standards to keep down agency costs. That would be a good opportunity as well. Attracting retail investors. We used to have them so many years ago, less in the past, recent past, but I think we could have an interesting point with privates. Attracting retail investors mean to be able to provide a very good information and accessible information. And I think that French companies deliver already high quality information. So I think we should take this opportunity to address one issue regarding the quality of information published by the listed company. The quality is a key point to attract investors and ensuring the proper functioning of the capital markets. And it's not just about giving ratios or something, it's just the content as well as the form. We will try to convince that high quality reporting is really key. And I think that corporate governance will contribute to the quality of reporting, is especially working. And as I was saying, I was chair of the French AFEP-MEDEF Corporate Governance Code. And it's extremely important what we have done in all those years, not only to address people when we're not acting, but to be as well a kind of a help when they needed a way or an answer to how to interpret such scores or how to face that situation. So it became part of the life, of the daily life, if I may say so, of the big corporations, just to adapt and to say, if you want to refer to the code, that's how you can do it in the best way. And it's been really a support from both sides. So I think quality of reporting is effectively working with that. We as well have legislation as well regarding the composition of the audit committees. I think people were aware of, is it the right way? And we in France, the code has made sure that 2/3 of independent members in the audit committee, whether the audit directive is only 1/2, a majority. We are really key in France to have that security, to make sure that information is really accurate. I think that's, to come back to my first point, considering what is at stake, which is financing the transition, which will require huge investments, It's high time policymakers change their priorities. We need to have public markets. Of course, we need to ensure financial stability. Of course, we need to have proper reporting. But I think we have now a good level in Europe on that. We have always permanently to work. But companies need measures to foster investments, innovation, and whilst preserving their competitiveness. So I think we have to act on all those points: investments, innovation, preserving the competitiveness of the companies. And that, I think that's altogether how we are going to succeed in that.
Thank you so much for that, Patricia. I mean, are you sensing a greater degree of urgency from policymakers and all stakeholders to make sure that European and global capital markets do thrive? Because certainly my perspective from the Financial Times is that this is something we've been writing about for years. It's only now in the past 12 months or so that it's garnered the level of attention that I think it's really warranted from our readers and from all sorts of different stakeholders here. It's a big priority for people. Is the urgency there, and is it soon enough?
The urgency is there, and I think the understanding of the emergency is there as well, much more. First, because of the change in the conditions of inflation, interest rate, economics, and all that aspects. And then, on the other hand, the knowledge now, the understanding of how much it will require to finance that transition. So the both things is much more money, much more investment requirements, and a market which is not so easy money, very low interest rates, no inflation, full employment or something. So I think those two parameters, those two aspects of parameters make for people and for companies and public sectors and everybody, understanding that now we have to act all together really now.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you so much for that. Amarjeet, we've been talking about lots of elements of the capital markets here, and one bit that we haven't necessarily spoken too much about is concentration among asset managers and asset owners. There's not just concentration in where money is raised, it's where it's held. The OECD Factbook has laid out a lot of data around that. In many emerging Asian economies, ownership concentration is driven by the importance of company groups, really. What can be done to ensure that these structures are transparent and that shareholder rights are adequately protected? What are your thoughts around concentration in this space?
Yeah, so that's another great question, very relevant in the context of many Asian economies and other places as well. So, talking about India, in fact, India had the opportunity, we at SEBI had the opportunity actually to work very closely with OECD on the company group structures prevalent in India. And there are a couple of reports available in the recent years. First, let's try and understand. Let me just give you one or two pieces of data before I answer your question. So if you look at the Indian stock markets, the National Stock Exchange, over 70% of the companies listed are listed on the National Stock Exchange. They have this sort of family domination, or we call them promoters in our terminology, and they account for, their shareholding is more than 50% in 70% of the companies. Promoters' shareholding is 50% or more, and they account for about 68% of the market cap. So we need to understand what are the risks around these structures, and especially, if you have, if you also add the cross-border element, if you have a holding company which has a subsidiary abroad, which has another subsidiary in another jurisdiction, that makes it even more complex. So there are potentially two important risks. One is that you have a listed company which has public shareholders. So the listed company is definitely impacted by the subsidiary or associate or a joint venture. So the more complex the structure, it gives an opportunity to hide the risk of the listed company somewhere else to the detriment of the shareholders, especially the minority shareholders. So, and that is why you need transparency. Again, I was talking about the abusive related party transactions. So if you have a complex structure, again, the possibilities of the potential of doing abusive related party transactions also go up. So we need to identify as a regulator the risks very clearly and then come up with a risk management strategy around that. And the answers are, you need more transparency. In your question itself, you said you need how to make it transparent. So what we have, just to give you some, again, I'm leaning on the Indian experience because that's what I know the best. So how we are dealing with it is in terms of the enhanced disclosure norms for companies, so in our jurisdiction, the shareholding pattern of all the companies has to be disclosed every quarter. And all the promoters or the controlling shareholder, even if they are holding one share, their names have to be given. And anybody else, any other shareholder holding more than 1%, those details have to be disclosed so that we know who's controlling the company. Then the consolidated financial results of the listed company along with the subsidiary have to be disclosed every quarter. Again, the idea is you should have full picture of financials at the group level. Then, we have also, this has all come from our experience. We've had some crisis. And so we have the requirement that the listed company will nominate one of its directors on the board of subsidiary, because the listed company needs to keep an eye on what is happening in the subsidiary company. So you put one of your independent directors on the board of subsidiary if the subsidiary is material, not all subsidiaries. And there is a definition of materiality and so on. So as I said, the risk is to minority shareholders. So another way we've looked at it is how do we empower the minority shareholders? So we've used a couple of tools there. So one is that we've, and that has worked very well to my mind. We have this concept of majority of minority voting. So where the controlling shareholders are not allowed to vote, and only the majority of minority will vote. And this we've deployed, for example, if there is a related party transaction beyond a certain threshold, and there's a materiality threshold there, then we don't want the related parties to, vote on that, and only the majority of minority will vote. We've also brought in the requirement of special resolutions where you need 3/4 majority, because if the promoters are if the family or the controlling shareholders are in majority, they can have everything, passed through because they just need 50% plus one vote. But if you have 75% plus one vote, then, you are giving a play for other shareholders in voting on the matters which are important and where there could be potentially a conflict of interest. So we've empowered the minority investors through the use of majority of minority and special resolution. And to top this, we've also mandated the provision of e-voting. So, you can just vote wherever you are. You don't really need to go to the meeting place. And, one vote, one share, one vote principle. So these are, some of the ways where we've tried to, and I think it has worked well in terms of transparency. And also, by the way, our Companies Act says a company cannot have more than 2 layers of subsidiaries. So there's a restriction on the number of subsidiaries you can create. There are certain exemptions in genuine cases, but that is a broader rule. But, let me make my final point. And this comes from my experience of watching the corporate developments over the last 3 decades, almost, not just in India and also abroad. See, the structure is just a form, you know, the real issue. I mean, there are people who are smart enough to beat any structure, right? And if you look at the corporate failures around the globe, it is just not private sector. It would also be public sector. It could also be sovereign wealth fund. So what I'm trying to say is that the real issue is, who are the people who are there? What is their ethical value system? What is the culture of the company? You can beat the form. I mean, we will keep chasing. You know, we see some crisis, we come up with a rule, but then the market players are ahead of you and they come up with something else. So the real issue is the ethical culture value system as it prevails. So form is less important. I think building an ethical culture value system is more important. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, more important and arguably more difficult to do. Thank
I agree, absolutely. That's abstract, but I think we have to make a beginning somewhere.
Yeah. We're running towards the end of our time, and I think there might be one intervention from the floor from the OECD side.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Pascal Durand-Barthez. I'm representing business at the OECD, otherwise known as BIAC. We reckon we represent about 9 million companies through their employers associations. And I'm going to make only 3 remarks. The first one is to say how much we appreciate having been part of the preparation of the principles of corporate governance over the years, and especially with the last revision. And this is for 2 reasons. The first is that companies are, in a way, the patient on the operation table, because we are talking about corporate governance, and therefore it can only be useful if we provide our experience from inside. The second reason is one of our key concerns, perhaps even an obsession, is free competition and the level playing field. And we believe that provided a harmonious, not uniform set of regulations on the way companies function can only be useful in that respect. My second remark is that, as has been mentioned earlier, companies are facing an unprecedented situation of crisis with all these issues on climate, geopolitical tensions, artificial intelligence coming into the market. And therefore, companies have more than ever in need of competent and independent directors. And providing a set of regulations and principles which reflect a global consensus of what is thought today to be the best solutions for effective governance can only be useful. And finally, what I will say is only that the important thing now is the implementation. The OECD has provided some extremely useful tools for that: peer reviews, self-assessments, assistance from the Secretariat, and what we are celebrating today, the Governance Factbook, which is a useful tool for that. And the focus should be on that, because having good rules is one thing, but implementing them is even more important. And we at BIAC are prepared to help again and provide as much of our experience from inside to continue working on this field, to give more visibility to the principles. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments there. I mean, time is very short, but perhaps Piercarlo, do you have any response to those thoughts? I'm wondering whether the new macroeconomic environment that we find ourselves in really will increase corporate focus on these matters, if it really does help to lower the cost of capital and to lubricate public markets. What's your thinking on that front?
Well, first of all, let me say that I appreciate very much BIAC work. When I was here, I had many opportunities of interacting. As far as the other question is concerned, I'm very embarrassed as an economist, because let's face it, when the multiple crisis scenario broke out, you did not have any comprehensive model available anymore. And this is where, as an economist, I feel myself to be placed. So we need to find a way to understand, if not the details, at least the basic interactions of the overall components. I think we all agree that one of the elements of the current situation is the interdependence of different areas of policy. So that's why we talk about geopolitics, because we want to talk about security, defense, health, finance, trade, investments. They all interact among themselves. And the reason is that now, when there is a policy decision taken by any countries, think of big countries, the question that comes to mind is, what are the economic/security implications of that happening? And you cannot simply say, I don't care about the security, because it doesn't work anymore like that. So that's my reflection, which is just accepting a state of frustration as an economist who thought we had good models. We have interesting models, but we need to also establish a much more effective interaction among skills and perspectives. This goes back to the board composition issue, which is extremely important.
Thank you so much. We've run out of time, but I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for such an engaging discussion. Patricia, Amarjit, Gun, and Piercarlo. Thank you all so much, and thank you everyone for listening.